Hello everyone, my name is Athena Buxton. I'm the Education Coordinator for the Hunter Museum of American Art, and today I'll be walking out how to crochet just using your hands and then some yarn you have lying around the house. Now today I will be using yarn. I always have yarn. I have oodles of it, especially in this time. I really love to crochet, and craft work gives you a little peace of mind and it's very relaxing. If you don't have yarn, you can use something else that you have in your home. Maybe you have twine, maybe you have some cord left over from a project for around your house. Those are perfectly okay to use. They'll work just as well, so everything I'll show you today, you can do that. And I'm going to go ahead and start walking through some of the steps to do this. Now I found out as I was digging through my giant yarn stash that I had 2 balls of yarn that were approximately the same color. Now I love when I crochet or do anything with yarn to use a chunky yarn. It's a little bit faster to make things. It's a lot softer when you finish something. So I'm going to be using both of these balls of yarn today, and I will be treating both ends just like one single piece of yarn because it's a little easier. I like to make it a little thicker, and this is the easiest way to do that. Now, if you only have one ball of yarn in your house, that's perfectly okay. It will work just as well. I'm just doing this because I like really thick yarn, so I'm going to treat this all as one string. Now, if you've never crocheted before, you've probably done many of the stitches that it takes to crochet. If you've ever been playing around with string when you were a kid, you might have just been fooling around making some knots and probably made some of the basic knots that we're going to work on today. Especially if you are a big Boy Scout or Girl Scout, you might remember some of the things that we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of find my end of yarn here. And to get started, we have to make a slip knot. Now, this is the basis of pretty much every crochet project. It's the start of most stitches. You're always going to start with this when you do crochet. So I'm going to take my hand instead of using a hook today. And if you have a hook and you want to follow along using your hook, you can do that. Perfectly okay. I'm just using my hands today. For those who might not have a hook, this is a good way to learn how to crochet, go through the basic motions. So taking my hand and then the end of my yarn, I'm just going to lay it over the palm of my hand and then over the back, and then come to the end and twist. So now they're overlapping, and then I'm going to use my hand to grab this little piece of thread that's still attached to my ball of yarn. This is what you call the working yarn. And I'm just going to pull through, and now I've made a slip knot. The great thing about a slip knot is if you ever need to adjust it, you need to make it a little smaller, you just pull on your working end of yarn. And again, that's the yarn that's attached to your, that's the end that's still attached to your ball of yarn. And then it has this little tail of excess. We're just going to leave that alone. You can cut it off when you're done. You can leave it on as sort of a decorative tassel. I'm just going to leave it alone for now. But again, if you need to adjust your little slip knot, make it a little bigger, you just pull on it, it gets bigger, pull on the working end, it becomes smaller. Now, instead of using a normal crochet hook like you would use for normal crochet projects, I'm just going to be using my index finger and the thumb on my dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, I'll be using my right hand. If you're left-handed, please use your left hand, just your index finger and your thumb, and I'm going to be working from right to left. If you're left-handed, you're going to be working from left to right. That's more comfortable. If you're ambidextrous, do whatever makes you the most comfortable and you're happy to do. I always work with my right hand. So taking my index finger and my thumb, form a little pincher. I like to say it looks like the beak of a bird. I'm going to go through my loop, and then just like before, I'm going to grab the working yarn, I'm going to use my left hand to keep the string nice and taut. It'll be a little easier for me. And then pull through. And that is how you make a chain stitch. And you can see it right here, that little loop with a new slip knot coming out of it. That's your chain. Now the chain stitch is the basis of most crochet projects. This is what you're going to do to start pretty much everything. It's also going to determine how wide your project is. So some of you, maybe you want to start making a blanket, maybe you want to make a napkin, maybe you want to make a scarf. You know, your chain stitch is going to determine how wide whatever you want to make is going to be. I want to make a little tea cozy because one of the things I've really enjoyed in this time is enjoying a nice cup of tea every day. And I would love to have a little mat to put my teapot on, so that's going to be working on. And for that, it doesn't need to be very wide since I'm making just a small mat for my tiny teapot. So I'm only going to chain about 9. And that's going to determine the width of my napkin. So I already have 1 chain that I did. Now I'm going to go through and do 2. So now there's 2. Again, taking my little pincher fingers, grabbing the yarn, pulling it through. Now I have 3. And then doing it again, 4. Taking my index and my thumb, grabbing the working yarn, pulling through to make another loop. And now I have 5. Then one more time for 6, 7, 8, and one last time to show how to do it. Index finger, my thumb, going through my little loop on the end, using my, almost dropped that, using my left hand to keep this taut, and then pulling through to form 9. So now I have a chain of 9 of my yarn. It's pretty loose. You can see a lot of gaps in it, but that's a good thing because it's a lot easier to find your stitches if there's gaps, and it's going to be a lot easier to put your fingers through because instead of using, you know, a tiny crochet hook like you would normally use, you're using your thumb and index finger, which is a little thicker. So if you have some openings in your stitches, that's perfectly okay. You want to have those. It's going to make it just a little bit easier. It's also going to make this a lot faster to make. The thicker your stitches, the more gaps between them, the less time it's going to take you to finish something. So I'm going to go ahead and start on my second row. So now that I have a chain of 9 all linked up, I now have to find where to start my second row. So I have this open loop at the end. I'm not going to count that. I'm just going to ignore that for right now. Then I'm going to go to 1 loop over, and that's 1. And then I'm going to find my second loop. So that's 2. And that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to skip this first loop right here and just move on to my second, and then I'm ignoring the open one. So now taking my index finger and my thumb again, making that little bird beak type shape, going through the loop, and then I'm going to take my index finger and put it through that second loop. So now on my finger, I have 2 loops. It may look a little weird for a second, but this is how we're going to start to do something called a single stitch. And this is the stitch we're going to use to finish whatever project you're starting, whether that's a blanket, a scarf, a napkin, maybe something else. This is the stitch we're going to be using for the rest of our project. So I'm going to take my little index finger and I'm going to use it just like I would a crochet hook. Here's the working end of yarn. And I'm going to use it to grab this yarn here and pull it through one of those loops. So now I have 2 loops again. And then using my index finger and my thumb, they're in both loops, I'm going to grab, pinch the working yarn, pull it through, and now I have 1 single stitch. And we've added about 1 inch to our project in height. So then I'm going to find the next loop. It's right here. And just like before, I have my index finger and my thumb in this open loop at the end. I'm going to put my index finger through that one. Now I have 2 loops on my hand, using my other hand to hold the yarn taut to make it a little easier. I'm going to pull one through that first loop. Now I have two again on my finger. Then using my index finger and my thumb, I'm going to pull through again. So now I have two single stitches. And I'm going to keep going across till I completely finish this row. To demonstrate again, index finger, my thumb, going through the loop, finding my next stitch here. Here's my next little loop. Sometimes if it's a little small and you can't see it, it might help to stick one of your fingers through to make a little space. Put my index finger through, get my working yarn, grab my index finger to pull it through the first loop, two on my hand again. I'm going to slip my thumb through it and then pull. Now, if you're doing this and there's a bit too much space here, like this is too big, you can always pull down to make it smaller or make it bigger. You want the loop to be just about as wide as your index finger and your thumb. That way you do have some nice big open stitches, but they're not too big that there's a very big hole in your project. So going through again, I found my next stitch over here. I'm going to put my finger through it to mark it. Then I'm going to take my index finger, put it through, using my left hand to keep the yarn taut. Use my thumb to pull it through. Now I have two on my index finger and my thumb, and then pinch working thread through again and forming another loop. Now as you're doing this, you might come to the end of your yarn. You're going to have to keep unraveling your ball of yarn if you are using a ball of yarn as you're doing this. I always like to have about a couple feet of yarn unraveled, and you'll see me periodically pull out some more. That's just going to make it a little bit easier. It also helps if you have a basket to put your ball of yarn and you're doing this. That way it can't roll all over the place. If my yarn falls off the table and I bend over to grab it, you'll know why. Keeping it there. So again, I'm going to find the next stitch to keep going, put my finger through, index finger through that little hole. So two loops on my hand, and then using my hand to keep this yarn taut, use my index finger to pull the yarn through the first loop. I have two loops on my hand again, and then pull through another single stitch. And we're just working along. And you might notice some of these aren't even. They might not be perfect, but that's perfectly okay. I always like to think in art that it's not about perfection. It's about doing something you're proud of and you're happy about. So don't worry if it's perfect. Imperfections make it special. It shows that you did it. So we're going to be perfectly okay that this stitch is a little bigger than the other ones. So again, I have my loop, my index finger, my thumb, putting my index finger through the next stitch, using my hand to keep the working yarn taut, pulling through one with my index finger, have two loops again, pinching, and pulling through the last loop. Now I have one more stitch left on this end, or just about one or two stitches left. So I'm going to finish those up real quick, and then I'll show you how to start on your next row. So doing the exact same thing I did before, pulling through, and then one last stitch on this row. This one's a little tight. It's be a little harder to pull through. There we go. And then my last single stitch. So I have my first row here, just with my hand, my little tea cozy. Now I'm going to show you how to move to the next row. So we need one more stitch on this before we can start the next row, but we already sort of came to the end of our chain. So I'm going to use my index finger, my thumb, just to pull through here to make the next loop, Now I have a little extra stitch, and I can go through and start on the next row. So I'm going to go ahead now that I have that extra stitch on the end, I'm going to flip this over so I can work from right to left again. If you were left-handed, you work the other way, but I'm going to flip it so it's a little easier, because working from this way back would be pretty hard for me. So I'm going to flip it over so this end is closest to my right hand with the open loop. And just like before, now that I have that extra stitch on the end, I can go ahead and find the first stitch in this row. And instead of just going in one loop like we did before, we're going to find these 2 loops on the end here. So these 2 loops are what I'm going to stitch into. So taking my index finger, putting it through those 2 loops, using it to pull through 1 loop, so I have 2 on my finger, then using my index finger and my thumb to finish that single stitch. So that's how you would go through, and just like before, you just continue going all the way along. When you came to the end, you'd make that extra chain stitch that we just made. You'd flip it over and do everything exactly the same way again, and keep doing it till you have the height that you want. So if you want to make a really long scarf, you would just sort of keep going on forever and ever till you got the length of skirt that you wanted. Since I'm just making a little tea cozy, I would stop it about here. So it'd be a nice square. You can make it as long as you want. And if you do finish your crochet projects that you did with your hand, I would love to see it. Please share with the Hunters Facebook page or Instagram. We would love to see the projects that you make. And it's always, you know, a great accomplishment when you finish something that you started. It always makes you feel so confident and special that you worked so hard to complete something. And I would love to see all your work. So thank you for tuning in, of course. And again, I'd love to see your projects. If you didn't use yarn, I would especially love to see how it turned out if you used twine or some of the other things I mentioned. Thank you all. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy and you enjoy crafting.